In this episode of FoME Friend, Loic and myself have a chat to Clare Donker.
Claire is a mechanical design engineer with ResMed, and in this episode we'll talk to her about her Cochlear internship, her career with ResMed, and her interesting work in the COVID-19 response. Enjoy.
Hey Claire, thanks for joining us today. How you going?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thanks. It's been a pretty busy day, but yeah, doing well.
Hey Claire, so we like to start this off with like a fun little question. So what would be your dream travel location after international travel is allowed again?
Oh, I'm definitely a beach person, so I think I'd have to go Maldives or something like that.
Oh, nice. Maldives would be good. Maldives would be good right about now.
Yeah, nice and relaxing.
So the first thing we want to kind of talk about is your internship at Cochlear. So what did you feel like you got out of that Cochlear summer internship experience?
Yeah, so for me, my internship at Cochlear was the first time sort of working in a full-time engineering role. And that was probably the biggest culture shock. So going from uni and working part-time to working 9 to 5 in an engineering role. And it was a huge learning curve, but something that I really enjoyed. The second kind of key learning was learning what teamwork looked like in a work environment. So in uni, you're sort of exposed to all of the group projects, and it's understanding that teamwork is really important, but in the work environment, teamwork is equally important, if not more important, and communication as well. So even if you're working on something independently, there's always someone who's relying on you to do that task. And so it's about kind of communicating clearly, keeping people in the loop with what you're doing. And that was something that I found was really important. And then on the kind of technical side of things, the team that I was in wasn't one of the kind of typical technical design engineering roles. But there was still things like reading standards, following test protocols, using different test equipment is something that I learned a lot about.
Wow, that's really interesting because you get a lot. You use a lot of those soft skills, but also develop some new technical skills as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So what kind of, you kind of touched on it a bit there, but so what was your kind of the task like? What was it like working there? What were kind of the things that you would be doing there for the internship?
Yeah, so I was part of the production support team, and their role at Cochlear is kind of, as it sounds, supporting the production team. So if one of the pieces of equipment that's on the manufacturing line goes down, they're kind of the first team who gets called to fix the problem. Another main part of their role is kind of introducing new equipment. So I worked on the introduction of a new instance of a sealing machine. So essentially it was a machine at the end of the manufacturing line, which kind of sealed the packaging. So I can talk a bit more about introduction of equipment and what the process looks like. But first off, my other task, which was sort of the main task I worked on, was annual requalification of the sterilizer. So the cochlear implant is obviously implanted. So one of the kind of key processes there is sterilizing the implant, making sure it's going to be safe to be implanted into the body. So each year they have to do annual requalification, basically to prove that the sterilizer is doing its job and is effective. So I was involved in kind of doing the testing and documentation, which goes along with that.
So you touched on a little bit, what was it like introducing these new things to the production line? What kind of things did you need to consider? How would that kind of work?
Yeah, so there's a few different processes. So it's called IQ, OQ, and PQ. And what that stands for is installation qualification, operational qualification, and process qualification. So it's essentially kind of 3 steps that you go through, starting off with kind of really basic. Does the machine fit where you want it to go? Does it meet the desired specification? So that's kind of the first stage, measuring up the machine, measuring up the space, making sure it's going to work. Operational qualification is then checking that the process is going to achieve the operational requirements. So working out kind of those functional limits, because a machine doesn't always work exactly as you want it to, there's going to be a little bit of range. For this one, it was a heat sealing machine. So there's obviously a range of temperatures that it's going to go across. So working out what's the minimum temperature that the product that's produced will still be up to scratch. So this involved a lot of running the machine and also testing. So going into the lab using an Instron, using a tensile and compressive tester, using some dye, making sure the seal was working as it was intended to do. And then the last step is process qualification. This was actually done after I left, but essentially it's running the process several times under normal operating conditions and just making sure that the product that comes out the other end is meeting the standards.
That sounds pretty hectic for an internship. I imagine you would have learned so much from that going forward.
Yeah, it was really good. I think kind of the main thing that I was so impressed by was that I was doing something that any other engineer in the company would have had to do had I not been there. So I think that was awesome. They don't just give you a project that to kind of keep you busy. It's something that they need to do regardless. So yeah.
Awesome. So after your internship, you finished your degree up at QUT, and then you started a graduate program with ResMed.
Yeah.
So for those who aren't familiar with ResMed, would you be able to explain what kind of technology they work on and a bit about the company?
Yeah, for sure. So our core business is in treating sleep apnea. So essentially sleep apnea is when you stop breathing during your sleep for multiple times over an hour. There's kind of an index that it's measured on. So I think if you stop breathing up to 30 times in an hour, you would then be classified as requiring a sleep apnea device. So that's kind of our core business. We have another business as well, which is in the respiratory care space. So that's kind of looking at the treatment of COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and some other respiratory conditions such as NMD, ALS, and so many others. And in addition to that, ResMed's kind of transitioning into a bit of a kind of software space, so providing software to out of hospital care. We all know the world's going into a very software driven space. So I think that's ResMed's way of kind of trying to keep up with that. A bit of background. So ResMed was actually founded at the University of Sydney back in about 1989. And it was the first kind of successful non-invasive treatment for sleep apnea. So it's pretty cool that it's an Australian invention. But now the headquarters for ResMed is in the US, so based in San Diego. That's where our corporate headquarters is. But we still do R&D and manufacturing here in Sydney and then also in Singapore. So to give you guys an idea of the size of the company, there's about 7,000 employees globally, and we operate in more than 120 countries worldwide. So there's the offices in the US, Sydney, Singapore, Dublin, Halifax, Munich. I think there might be a few others as well. We currently have 11 million cloud connected devices. So that's a device that's pretty much sending data up to the cloud every night, which is pretty incredible. And in 29, the revenue was 2.6 billion US dollars. So it's a fairly big medtech company.
It's good to see the international presence coming from an Australian invention there.
Yeah.
So, as you went through this, started at ResMed through the graduate program, would you be able to comment on the process and when applying for this, and maybe some of the tips that you might give to someone who would like to follow in your footsteps?
Yeah, sure. So for my year of grads, I'm not sure if it's changed since, but I can share my experiences. So the applications opened in around March, and I think that's pretty similar for quite a lot of companies these days. And the process that I went through was, the first one is sending through your resume and cover letter. So in this stage, what happens is there's engineers and also HR reps who will read through all of these, and kind of what they're looking for is your involvement in extracurricular activities and also any part-time work that you do, and internships. So part-time work, even things like working at Macca's, something like that. They just want to get an understanding that you can kind of balance tasks and your time management skills. The next stage for us was kind of a short recorded interview. So our question was just answering a few questions about why we wanted to work at ResMed, what we could bring to ResMed, and what we hope to gain out of the grad program. I remember last year they did a video of teach us something new. So they kind of try and change this step up each year. And again, engineers and HR will review the video. And they're really looking for someone to stand out from the crowd and do something a bit interesting. The next step for us was then an assessment centre. So that was down in Sydney. And it was a whole morning of activities. So there was an interview and then a group activity, manufacturing tour, and also the opportunity to meet some of the previous grads. So one thing that I think they really look for in this stage is kind of your teamwork in that team building activity, and how you kind of lead a team if you take that role in the group tasks. And then the next stage, which was the final stage, was interviews with vice presidents. So that was, again, a travel down to Sydney. And there was 2 interviews on that day. I think they were about half an hour each, and each of them had 2 vice presidents in the room. So it was pretty daunting, but everyone's really friendly. So it wasn't too bad once you kind of got over that initial fear of the interview.
Cool. So for you as well, did you accept the grad program for ResMed first, or did you have any other offers on the table? And how is this important to you in shaping your career path?
Yeah, so I received the offer from ResMed in about June. Having gone through the Cochlear internship program, the way that works is they kind of hire graduates out of the internship program. Unfortunately, I knew at this stage I hadn't received the job at Cochlear. And though after going through the internship there, I kind of knew I really wanted to work in the medical device industry. So after receiving the offer in June, I kind of knew I wanted to take it straight away. Having spoken to some of the grads at the assessment centre, and also just having seen the campus down in Sydney, I kind of knew I would really like it. So it was a pretty easy decision for me. I didn't have any other offers on the table at the time, but I was still in the process of some other job applications. Not sure if you guys are going through the same thing at the moment, but you kind of apply for so many jobs at once and sort of hope to hear back.
Yeah, you apply for everything.
Yeah.
Especially when applying for a lot, you kind of lose track.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't remember applying for that job.
Yeah.
So, once you actually were in the grad program, it looks like it was quite structured. You mentioned you had to go through 4 different rotations. Can you comment about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of really liked the structure of the program. It meant you knew what to expect. So it was 2 years and 6 months in each of your teams. The 6 months kind of feels like a long time, but equally it gives you a really good understanding of what that team does, and also gives you a good chance to kind of get to know people really well and actually have a task that you can work on and feel like you're making a difference in that team. Rotating through the 4 different teams was really good. It means now I have a pretty big network around the company, so I kind of know who to turn to if I have a question, and that's always a really good thing to have. I've also been given a pretty broad range of experiences. So I went through product management, which is something that not a lot of engineers would get to do. So that's kind of, they call it marketing, but it's sort of more closely related to product management. So it's the people who kind of define what the product is going to look like, I guess, is the easiest way to explain it. But something that is really good about that is when you're in a meeting with these people from teams such as product management, you kind of understand their role. So if they're asking you to do something, you can sort of get a good reason as to why they might be asking you to do that. And you kind of understand things from their perspective a bit more as well. One challenge that I'll say about going through a 2-year grad program is that whilst you come out with a really broad range of experiences and a broad network, there are people who come out of uni and go straight into a technical role, say. And so they get 2 years to kind of really hone their technical skills in that one specific area. So having gone out of the graduate program and into a mechanical role, I found sometimes I have a bit of a steep learning curve to kind of catch up on some of those skills that I maybe didn't get in those 2 years. But for me, I kind of liked the challenge. So I think it was good.
That's so impressive. And that kind of leads to what your current role is with the mechanical engineer. So what is your current role? What's your like day-to-day like?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that ResMed's core business is in sleep, but I'm actually in the respiratory care team. So we kind of design ventilators, non-invasive and invasive ventilators, which is some of the things that are being used right now in the COVID-19 crisis. So you might have kind of seen a bit about that on the news. That's kind of what my team works on. My primary role as a mechanical engineer is as a component owner. So I'm actually responsible for 3 kind of parts or assemblies in the device that we're working on. So it's a new non-invasive ventilator. I'm working on some of the outer enclosures, which is pretty interesting. So learning a lot about kind of plastic injection molding, industrial design, and kind of how to design a part, as simple as that sounds. And so my responsibility as the part owner is kind of taking those parts from the concept phase all the way through detailed design, tooling, testing, up to production, making sure it's designed well for assembly, and kind of taking in all of those considerations. Another thing that I work on is I'm really passionate about patient awareness and kind of developing this in our department. So I kind of lead what we call a capability development within our department. So I kind of work with people in the company who have really good knowledge in this area and kind of work at disseminating this to our department. So one example is, so there's COPD is kind of a restricted ability to breathe. So there's an activity called the straw challenge. Try it out if you want to. So you basically cut a plastic straw, put it in your mouth, and try and walk up the stairs breathing only through the straw. So that's a way to kind of, show someone what it's like to live with COPD. So bringing these activities into the department to get a better understanding of what our patients are going through is something that I'm pretty passionate about. And then my other role in the team is being the mechanical representative for usability. So this is kind of a way for me to interact a bit more with some cross-disciplinary teams. And I'm basically responsible for delivering mechanical input into this team. And this team delivers the required usability testing and documentation to meet the requirements for a medical device. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. Definitely lots of different things that I get to be involved in.
That's really interesting. So going back to those design processes, what kind of like engineering programs do you use? Because it kind of helps a lot of people to understand what kind of the benefit of using all these programs at uni.
Yeah, so at ResMed, we use Creo as our CAD package. So I remember when I was going through uni, it was SolidWorks. So Creo is pretty similar to SolidWorks. The interface is a bit different, but where it's really powerful is for kind of designing larger scale devices. So I mentioned that I work on kind of 3 components. These 3 components obviously meet with a bunch of others. So there's 10 people in my team all working on designing different parts of the device. And Creo's got a really powerful ability to kind of set up what they call skeletons. So you can base your design off a skeleton, and then someone else who's interfacing with your part can base their part off the same skeleton, which means that it'll always meet up perfectly. So that's kind of the main thing that I'm on day to day. We also use ANSYS for simulations. So I use that kind of less regularly. It depends what design phase we're in. And that's kind of the 2 main programs. We're also coming into the tooling phase, so looking at some mold flow programs, but I'm yet to learn about that. So, yeah.
So with that as well, how do you go about learning those new skills that you need for your job? Do you learn off people that, in your team, or do you have to do external courses?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different options. There's a TAFE course, which is run about kind of injection molding basics. So that's something that you can get involved in. And then what I kind of rely really heavily on is the lead engineers in our team. So there's people who have been through these processes before, and they kind of set up little training programs, I guess, to kind of teach you something before you have to do it yourself. So for example, we're coming up to creating a 2D spec, and I've created a 2D spec at uni, but the parts are quite complex that we're designing. And so it's a pretty different beast to tackle. So one of the more senior people in the team would set up a training session and kind of go through that.
And you also mentioned that program with where you're working with patient awareness. Was that kind of something that you driven, or like how much support like do you get with those kind of programs working with ResMed?
Yeah, so I guess it kind of came out of a conversation I was having with my manager. And it's just something that's kind of driven from my interest. There's a lot of support always available. So my manager will work with me. I've got a team at ResMed. There's a department called Medical Affairs, and that's kind of their role, is kind of understanding the patient and having that clinical perspective. So I work quite closely with them for this. Not sure if that answers the question.
Yeah, it's really interesting. That's something you were interested in, became a conversation with your managers, and then you could work that into a program. So that's really cool.
Yeah.
So kind of coming into like the present now, obviously we're in unprecedented times with the COVID-19 going around. What's it been like having to work with ventilators and, kind of responding to the current demand?
Yeah, so to put the problem into a bit of perspective, these are some stats that I heard a couple of days ago. So last year, we made 18,000 ventilators in the calendar year. And then since January this year, we've already made 52,000 ventilators. Whoa. So yeah, so the increase has been up to almost 10 times in some cases. So a lot of the work with these projects has been around the supply chain and logistics. So how do you increase capacity of your manufacturing sites to produce up to 10 times the amount of ventilators? That's something, it's a huge problem. But the teams that are responsible for this have done a whole lot of work into getting this to happen. Manufacturing's kind of gone to 24/7 with a couple of shifts in some instances. But from an engineering perspective, the problem's kind of been more around finding alternative components. So in some cases, our kind of second and third tier suppliers may not be able to supply as many components as what we need. And so the engineer's responsibility is kind of finding an alternative component to replace that one and justifying how it's equivalent to the current part and what the impact might be to the system. And in all times kind of making sure that it's going to meet the regulatory standards, kind of thing.
So going off it as well with the regulatory standards, have you had to use different manufacturing techniques to kind of figure out what parts you need so you can make the ventilators?
Yeah, so a lot of the changes haven't necessarily been different manufacturing techniques, but rather kind of alternatives of the same thing, if that makes sense. So then the responsibility is kind of making sure that supplier meets the regulatory standards that are necessary for a component that's going into a medical device. So for an electrical component, it's probably not as important as something that's going to be in the air path of the device. So there's different regulatory standards attached to different parts of the device, if that makes sense. The project that I've kind of been most closely working on in the COVID-19 space is kind of looking at our accessories that are used with the ventilators. So I'm not sure if you guys have ever seen a ventilator set up, but essentially there's the device, and then you've got like a tube, oftentimes some filters and other accessories within the space between the tube and the mask, which is on the patient's face, or if it's intubated, between there. But anyway, we'll pretend it's a mask for now. So what I've been working on is kind of alternative supply of those accessories. So things like the tubing. And the responsibility then is to make sure that the supplier who's providing the tubing is meeting the necessary regulatory standards. And most of that information is kind of shared through labeling, testing, but in all instances, we've kind of been looking at products which already exist on the market, if that makes sense.
So because they're an accessory to your medical device, they would also be classified as medical devices, is that right?
Yeah, in most cases, yeah. So then we would just be acting as the distributor of their parts.
Okay. So are there any regulatory requirements that you need to use to make sure that they're compliant with how they interact with your device?
So yes and no. It's more kind of system requirements that we look at. So things like in a tube, you've got the resistance of the tubing. So is it kind of resisting or compliance as well? How is it impacting how the system will perform on the patient? But the way that our system specification is written is in a way that those kind of values have a range where our device will still work. So then what my job has kind of been is looking at how the tube performs and what standards that meets. So for example, looking at the resistance and compliance values that the manufacturer sends to me and making sure that they fit within what our system specification says.
Cool. So from this, are there any extra skills that you think you've picked up that'll be able to help you in the long term?
Yeah, so I was kind of working in a system role, which was a bit daunting to me at the start because I have never done a systems engineering role. And so definitely skills that I've learned are kind of being adaptable, agile and flexible, but also problem solving. So say one of the accessories didn't meet the specification, what are our next steps? So sometimes it was kind of setting up a test that needed to be run, having just a conversation with someone who's more experienced than myself and kind of knows a bit more about the system, those kind of skills. So more soft skill development rather than technical skill, I would say.
Oh yeah, that's definitely something that you'll be picking up with this kind of change in situation. We always like to end off with like, what would be your top 3 tips for undergrads?
Oh, top 3. Okay. My first one would probably be to ask a lot of questions and be comfortable in asking questions. I know I probably didn't do enough of that going through uni, but it's a skill that I've kind of had to develop in the workplace and kind of being comfortable not knowing the answer all the time and reaching out to people. Second tip I would give is kind of get involved in lots of things while you're at uni. It's once you go into full-time work, you'll find your time kind of gets sucked away from you. And so using uni as the time to kind of get involved in lots of extracurricular activities, it'll help you with your time management and it'll also help you get jobs, I think, as well. It's something that employers look for is involvement in other activities and having different interests, maybe outside engineering, maybe within engineering. And my third tip would be kind of trying to do some more hands-on things during uni. So something that I found in the workplace is we do a lot of prototyping, and some of these are skills which I probably didn't develop as much as I could have during uni. So getting involved in the kind of building aspect of the group projects, and learning about those type of things, because I definitely found in my mechanical engineering role that that's something that is really heavily reliant on, is your ability to kind of use different equipment, build things, fail fast, that kind of stuff.
Oh, thank you. They're really awesome tips. Well, thank you very much for spending the time to answer our questions and chat with us here. We hope you will make sure you send us some photos when you get over to the Maldives. Okay.
Yeah. No worries. It was great to meet you both.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thanks for having a chat with us, Claire.
No problem.
Thanks again for listening, and a big thank you for Clare Donker for phoning in.
Make sure to like and subscribe to the FoME Friend YouTube channel, and we will see you next time.